Thank you for the invitation. I feel very much at home here among friends, a family that I have somehow been adopted into. So, European Coalition for Israel, we have our first president, Willem Glaashauer, who is here. He's an honorary president by now, and we have another president, Rudolf Geige, who is sitting very discreetly at the back. And Harald Eckert apparently is not here. But we have this long tradition of working very closely together with Christians for Israel. It's also good to see many new friends here. Johannes Gedloff, not sure we have met properly before. He's busy now. I wanted to comment and say one thing that I like about him, besides giving a very good presentation, I like your hairstyle. I think it's very... They say it's a sign of intelligence when we have a good forehead. So take it as a compliment. I'm going to share a little bit on a more practical note what we do as European Coalition for Israel, how we operate, perhaps a few words how we started, and what's on the agenda right now. And during a year which we believe to be very pivotal, very strategic for the future of Israel, the future of Jerusalem. I just came actually back from a meeting with the mayor of Jerusalem and was very touched to receive this very nice pin, the Lion of Jerusalem. And for us this was a great moment to work more closely together with the municipality of Jerusalem during the 50th anniversary, and I will come to that in a few minutes. Just to back up and come back to European Coalition for Israel, why are we doing this work? I liked when Johannes, he dared to be a bit provocative at times. I think that's a great gift, and I dare to do the same. I think it's wonderful and it's beautiful when we can all agree here or at home, if we are lucky, within the four walls of our churches, on what is right, what does the Bible say, what's the right thing to do. But I'm afraid it will be of little significance and consequence if it stays there. And I think the idea with the European Coalition for Israel to go outside of the comfort zones and to go into the lion's den, so to speak, of this world, the places that good Christians dislike, like nothing else in the world, be it the European Union, be it the United Nations, be it UNESCO, and realize that we, as Friends of Israel, have a mission there. And I always tell this very simple story to explain why we started the coalition. The story goes back to 1938, July, the Evian conference. The question on the agenda, what are we going to do with the Jewish refugees? Because people could see at that time that things were not going well in Germany. And there were a few 100,000 Jews that wanted to get out of Germany, but the problem was that there was no Israel at that time that could receive them. The question was which nation would open up their borders and receive them in the spirit of humanitarianism, in the spirit of brotherhood, in the spirit of Christianity. The sad fact, as we know, is that out of that conference came a very clear message. The nations were not interested in receiving Jews. If we want to be very clear, there was the Dominican Republic made a pledge, I think, to receive something like 10,000 Jews. But by and large, the nations turned their back and they said, well, you know, it's a pity, but we can't help. My point is only this. Where were the Christians? Where were the Christians for Israel at that time? And I make this statement, and it may sound very, rash in a way, but I believe if there had been even a handful of people at that time, July 1938, who would have bartered to go to the conference, to raise awareness of these issues with their governments, to write a letter to the editor, raise hell, to use a good Christian expression. Things could have been different today. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of Jewish people would be alive today. But they were nobody. And as it says in the Word of God, when God speaks and he said, I looked for a person, I couldn't find anyone. So my message is also, we don't need 1 million people in order to have an impact. We don't need 100,000. We don't even need 1,000. But we need a few good men and women, especially today on International Women's Day, who wants to make a difference. So the point, what we're trying to do is to translate all the convictions that we have here and make it relevant in the arenas where the decisions will be taken. That will define the future of Jerusalem. That will define the future of Israel. And there are a few places in the world which, the world is an organized structure. And when we read in the Bible about these epic battles of the last days, we tend to look at them in a very religious term and see people coming riding on their camels or on their horses. But the world is a very structured place. We can even say, listen, these are the places where decisions will be taken that will define the future of Jerusalem. We are then looking at United Nations General Assembly. Its predecessor, the League of Nations, was the first time in modern history where, first of all, the concept of nationhood made sense. And when the nations came together in an orderly way to say, let's make decisions together. And the first issue that they were confronted with, interesting, was Palestine. What to do with the Jewish people? When the League of Nations failed, there was a new organization called the United Nations. And interesting again, what was the first major issue that the United Nations had to deal with when they were constituted? Israel. So it's interesting how the nations and Israel are so very concretely connected in these. You could think perhaps of 193 other issues that could be brought to the forefront when the nations come together, but in both cases it was Israel. So what we try to do is to use the language of international law, work together with bright people like Andrew Tucker and other international lawyers, and to present something which we believe are very reasonable arguments. And the reason I say they are reasonable is that when you sit down one-on-one, that can be the chief negotiator of the European Union, that can be the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, and you sit down one-on-one and you discuss this, and they said, you're absolutely right. But of course I can't say this publicly. So it's not that sometimes we are very intimidated as Christians and we think, well, of course, here we can be a bit happy-clappy and all agree, but, let's not get out of this very warm atmosphere because, then they're going to hit us, they're going to punch us, and we don't really have the arguments, and, it's maybe biblically true, but it's not really true outside of that. This is not true. We have a very solid argument to defend Israel, and only for those who even bothers to get involved and get on with it, we have the best possible case. So we have no excuses. Leading up to Jerusalem, let me just take you on a very short journey that will also explain a little bit how we function. In 2010, we came to realize that what happened in San Remo, Italy, in April 1920 is something that, for whatever reasons, have been hidden in the archives and has not been given proper exposure. And we felt as an organization that this is something where we may be able to play a part. And I have a background as a journalist, and I've done some, maybe PR work as well. So I know that in order to get the message across, there are two things that needs to come into place. It's the right date and the right place. If you have a message, it can be as revolutionary as anything. If you miss the date, and if you don't combine it with the right location, nobody cares. So we knew that we had to go to San Remo, Italy. We had to identify the very place where the rights of the Jewish people to reconstitute the state of Israel in their ancestral homeland in Palestine, where this was given. And I would like to look at this moment as one of those rare moments in history where heaven and earth met, where the earth was in complete agreement with the covenants made to God's people. And even the language, as you will see in the San Remo resolution, is very biblically inspired, and they affirm these 3,000 years of connection between a people and the land. And we felt that this is a message that we need to dig deeper in and that we need to present to the nations. And again, it doesn't do any good if we organize another Christian conference and we say, well, this is fantastic, but we need to bring it to the leaders of the world. So this is what we did in a number of ways. We did a video, Give Peace a Chance, 12 minutes, with a very young, good Dutch producer, Lennart Fierre, which really reached all the corners of the world. We even know that John Kerry watched the video just as an example. But really an impact in the international arena. We wrote a petition together with Andrew at that time in 2011, which said, "Keep Jerusalem united." This was at the time when the Palestinians wanted to declare statehood unilaterally at the United Nations. And we said, no, we have to stand up, we have to make this point. And we gathered something like 60,000 handwritten signatures. Just a short point here, this is something that we want to do again in time for the 50th anniversary. So I think all of us to think creatively how we can get this message out and deliver something similar, something much stronger this time. We had 60,000 signatures that time. We had a list of 50 very prominent government ministers, former government ministers, members of parliaments who signed this letter. And we brought it to the attention of the Secretary General of the United Nations in 2011. I always go back to this Evian moment, and I'm not born before 1938, despite my gray hair. So that was not my moment. And it doesn't, sometimes we get very emotional and we said, oh, what would we have done? And I felt, some of us believe that God somehow speaks to us in our hearts. And I had a moment in my life when I asked this question. And I felt the Lord say, well, it's an interesting question, but it's the wrong question. What will you do today for my people? So we believe there will be these Evian moments, again, when nations will come together. We know in the history books there were nobody in 1938 in Evian. My only aspiration in life is not even to change history. It's not to change the content in the Bible. I wish I could. The very troubling scenarios that I read about. Well, of course, I also know Isaiah 2, so I know eventually it will, play out wonderfully. But the only point is this. Will we do what only we can do? There are other things that only the Lord, the God of Israel, can do. But will we do our part? Regardless of when and where that moment is. And I believe there will be many moments. But there was one, and I wished I had a video clip, because we campaigned for something like 1.5 years. And because we wanted to warn the nations about the foolishness of declaring a Palestinian state unilaterally without even asking the Israelis. And of course we failed. Humanly speaking, we failed because November 2012, this Palestinian so-called state, observer state, was recognized by the UN. And there was something like 8 nations out of 193 who voted with Israel. But the beautiful memory, someday when I'm going to write my memoirs and try to look back on these moments that I'll never forget, is that through the friendship that we have with the Israelis, Ambassador Prosor, he said, listen, I want you to be with us in the chamber of the United Nations, General Assembly, during that vote. And humanly speaking, it's very difficult. It's only ambassadors, and they would bring government ministers in there. But, by God's grace, he said, Thomas, and it was Gregory Lafitte, and it was Judy Littleman, he said, I'd like that we sit together. So at this moment, when all the nations were voting for this Palestinian state, and there were only these very, very few, United States, Canada, Czech, these wonderful Pacific islands, we were there. And I remember this one moment, which is so funny, because my wife, she's sometimes embarrassed of me for a number of reasons, and she said, when we go to a concert or football match, I say, why do you always clap so hard? This is how you clap. And but that was for a reason, because the Palestinian leader had spoken, and the whole General Assembly, they raised their feet, and this was like the greatest moment in history when a Palestinian state was to be declared. And then Ron Prosor came, ambassador, and he had to speak, and he knew what he was up against. So when he was ready, and it was complete silence, it was so embarrassing, and I just, without thinking, I just did the first boom, boom, boom. And how it works, simple psychology. 3, 4, 5 seconds, the whole the General Assembly, boom, 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 boom. And that may seem like a small, silly detail, because we lost, humanly speaking. But I think the point, Rabbi Jacobs, is that we were there. We were there. And it was so funny that evening, because we were not there alone. CNN was there, Al Jazeera was there, BBC was there. So I kept receiving all these emails from all over the world and said, Thomas, what on earth are you doing on Al Jazeera? You're on BBC and you're on CNN. And God is the best documentist, what's the word? Well, person making documentation there is in the world. So, for this moment when people say, well, did the Christians do anything at all? I'm sure, this is all in the archives. And we have the clips, and that's what I wanted to show. We were there, representing you. I think this is also a point. We can't, not all of us are called to go into the United Nations. But, all of us are called to pray, to support in whatever way we can. And, to be honest, financially as well, because we don't receive any government funding. You're looking at me as I have 2 more minutes. Is that correct? Good. Yeah. So the story doesn't stop there. And I think we are now entering, well, maybe I should say that, just to prove the point, that after San Remo, I thought, that was the end of it. But I believe the Lord just opened up in the most amazing way to present this to parliaments in Rome, in Berlin, in The Hague, in the European Parliament, the Parliament of Japan, which was also part of those nations of the Supreme Council of the Principal Allied Powers, and the Security Council of the United Nations. And I remember, because this is my only aspiration in life, I know, well, the little I know about the God of Israel is that He is sovereign. He's not asking of me to change anything, change any heart. I can't do it. But I think one thing that He can require of me, of us, is to speak up. The responsibilities ends there. But again, 2012, a private luncheon with the ambassadors of the UN Security Council. If you want to define where is the power of this world concentrated into, it was in that room. And to be able, together with our good friend from Toronto, Jacques Gauthier, be able to present what Andrew just said in a way that after the presentation there was no one objecting. And you had nation after nation after nation after nation there. And this is what I believe the Lord is asking of us. He will ultimately bring the nations to a place of judgment, but He will not send angels. He will not come down to convey this story. This is what Christians for Israel is entrusted with. And anyone, as a Christian, Jew for that matter, people of no faith, that want to stand up for what is the right thing. I had many, many more things I could say, but I also believe in order and structure, so I will stop here.
Thank you, Thomas. I was thinking of what Willem Glassauer said this morning, or yesterday. When I was naked, or when I was in prison, where were you? Where were the nations? And what Thomas shared and what Andrew shared is when Israel is in need, in Evian, in the past, we can think, what if I had lived then? But this is what Thomas rightly says, you are living now, and what you are doing now. And one other thing, we can be happy-clappy inside, but what do we do outside? And often when we are outside, we are afraid we are lacking arguments. But these wonderful guys help us with the right arguments and help us with information. You can visit your website. You can follow him on Facebook. He's never at home. I don't know how his wife knows how he claps because he's. But thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, Johannes Gerloff, of sharing with us today the broader perspective of Israel in the world and what's happening around us, and giving us tools in discussions with people, not to convince them, since I think the Holy Spirit needs to convince them, but to feel not insecure. Yes, we have the arguments. Yes, we do not believe something strange. Besides biblical belief, what we have, there are also normal logical arguments how to defend Israel.